Now take your Bible, turn to Acts chapter 21. We'll follow Paul's journeys as he brings his third missionary journey to a close in Acts chapter 21 and see the events that begin to unfold in Jerusalem. Now let's begin reading in verse 1. Now remember, Luke is with Paul, and so we see that pronouns of we and us as we're reading this. And that's kind of the tag that Luke is there. And really, when you read this, and this is really going to get interesting in the last two chapters of the book of Acts, but notice the terms that Luke is using to describe their journey. And I'll point those out to you on the way, and it kind of fills in the picture. Pay attention to those terms instead of a black and white imagination, and start coming into color for you to see what all's happening here. And it came to pass that after we were gotten from them, I'm going to stop right there. My English teacher would not have let me get away with that. After we were gotten from them. She would tell me that's not, and you know, I remember one time my English teacher didn't like the way I punctuated a sentence, and I turned to the Bible and showed her a sentence punctuated just like that, and she didn't like me doing that. She didn't like me doing that. The King James Version is often criticized for its Renaissance English. That's what they'll call it. I mean, it's such flowery language, they say. And it is not. I mean, this is just bare, simple, raw, basic terms. And we don't even talk like that, do we? I mean, after we were gotten from them. I can just see some mother explaining to her little boy, no, don't say it like that. And say a better way. And the modern versions probably say it something a little different than that. But now listen, that is not hard to understand. It might be a little rugged. And really the ruggedness of the King James Version is one of the reasons it's such a delight to read, really, when you get to thinking about it. And so the King James Version, even though we don't use language like that, that's easy to understand, isn't it? So just don't be fooled by people telling you that it's hard to understand. I sometimes tease my friends that go to Bible college, and they talk about how hard the King James Version is to understand. And I tell them, well, we've got shopkeepers and truck drivers and farmers. They all understand it, and they don't understand why these Bible graduates have so much trouble with it. So it's not hard to understand. Just don't ever get that in your head and just enjoy the language the way it is. But that's kind of a minor point. Let's go back and read again. And it came to pass that after we were gotten from them and had launched, see that word launched? Now that sounds like they pushed that vessel out into the sea, doesn't it? Well, I like those words that describe this now. After they had launched, we came with a straight course to Coos. Notice that straight course. See, sailing right toward that island. And I said that right. If you have a pronunciation Bible, pronouncing Bible, it's a two-syllable word. It is Coos. I would have probably said goose, but it is Coos. And this morning, Lily Ann was reading this in class and got that exactly right as she read through that. I was proud of how well she picked up on that. So we came a straight course to Coos, and the day following on the roads, and from thence into Patara, and finding a ship sailing over Phoenicia. Now, finding a ship. Sounds like they were changed ships there at Patara. They were on one ship, and now we got a ship going right where we're going. The ancient travel among those ship things is almost like the old hitchhikers used to do. Get out on the highway, and you're going toward a certain direction, and somebody says, well, I'm going this far. But then I'm going this way, and you'll have to take somebody else. Well, take me that far. And you get that far, and then you look for a car to carry you the next way. And that's kind of the way they did these ships. Are you going our way? Well, we're going to Patara, but then we're going to go. And it says, well, at Patara, they found one going to Phoenicia. That's where they wanted to go. And so it sounds like they made a change of ships there. So Finding a ship sailing over to Phoenicia, we went abroad and set forth. Now when we had discovered the Cyprus, look at that. Show you on a map how important that was in just a minute. It didn't mean no one had ever been to Cyprus before. You know, we say Columbus discovered America, don't we? But it didn't mean that nobody had ever seen Cyprus, but they were looking for Cyprus. And out there in the land, out there in the open sea, and someone there on the lookout, and someone says something like, land ho, that's Cyprus. And now they know how to navigate. Now they know where to go. So after we had discovered Cyprus, we left it on the left hand and sailed into Syria and landed at Tyre, for there the ship was to, now watch this, the ship was to unladen her burden. Isn't that interesting how that is written? I sometimes think about that going into heaven's harbor. We've got our burdens, don't we? We're carrying our burdens. One day we're going to lay those burdens down, sail our ship right into heaven's harbor and unladen our burden. Isn't that going to be beautiful? Now that's not what this is talking about, but that's where that language comes from, right there. And so the ship unlaid her burden, and finding the disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said to Paul through the Spirit that he should not go up to Jerusalem. Now all along, Paul's being warned, don't go to Jerusalem. Don't go to Jerusalem, which creates a little bit of a dilemma. The Spirit says don't go to Jerusalem. Why is he going? Well, what the Spirit is doing here is warning him about there's going to be trouble waiting for you in Jerusalem. It's not really a command not to go as much as it is a warning about going. And that'd be the way to understand that, because Paul has always followed the direction of the Spirit on his journeys, and he wasn't going to violate that now. So the Spirit's warning Paul by doing this, and Paul knows that. He's warning them, when you get to Jerusalem, there's going to be trouble. And Paul is going anyway. Now let's get the map. And look, I want you to look at all the little villages. Coos, Rhodes, Patara, Phoenicia, Cyprus, Syria, Tyre, the villages, the islands, the regions. A lot of detail here, isn't there? I never noticed it until this study. Every time you go through Acts, you learn something, don't you? Remember when Paul went throughout the regions of Galatia and Phrygia? We just drew a big arrow around. We didn't know where he went. But now it's every little village, every little harbor, all along the way that Luke is naming them. What's the difference? Well, Luke is with him now. And so Luke is identifying every little spot along the way. You can tell Luke is there because of the we and us pronouns, but you can also tell he's there by all the detail he's going in about all the little places they went. Let's look at it on the map. We start here at Miletus. That's where they're leaving from after he'd bade goodbye to the elders. And he goes down to the island of Coos, and then over to Rhodes, and then to Patara. And there they find a ship sailing toward Phoenicia. And they head out over that open sea. You see that little arrow curved? I guess that's to represent we're looking for Cyprus. We'll know which direction to sail. They didn't have GPS on the little ship out there to tell them which way to go. They probably didn't even have a compass. I think a compass was discovered later. We sometimes talk about pilots flying by the seat of their pants, where they don't have any instruments. They'd get up in those old biplanes and just fly looking for landmarks and kind of guessing which way to go to get there. That's the way they would sail on that old Mediterranean Sea. They would have to have knowledge of the currents and the winds and the coast and the places and look for landmarks along the way. So they head out, and they know it's in this general direction. Look for Cyprus. When you see Cyprus, we'll know what to do. And so they discovered Cyprus. Wouldn't that be interesting to be on a voyage like that? And they went around Cyprus and kept Cyprus to their left hand. See? They knew. Okay, we get Cyprus, we'll just scoot right around there, keeping Cyprus off to our left. And you see that little knob right there at the end of Cyprus? I bet you that was their landmark. When we get there, we'll know this is the direction we need to head. And so they headed from there and then head back out over the ocean sea and came right into Tyre where they were headed. Now that's some pretty good navigating, isn't it? By the seat of your pants kind of navigating that they did that. So here they are at Tyre. Now, and when we had accomplished those days, we departed and went our way, and they all brought us on our way with wives and children till we were out of the city, and we knelt down on the shore and prayed. Paul leaves Tyre. They go to the shore. But notice how it said the wives and children went there. Okay, wives, mothers, think about that. Taking your children out there. You know, the children then, they're like children now. They require a lot of attention. Sometimes you have to take a whole lot of stuff with you. Just take care of that child. And they don't always behave themselves, do they? And they'll get hungry and they'll be whining and fussing, and some of them running off, getting lost and bringing them back. And they took their children there. The wives took the children. Why am I bringing this up? It was important for those mothers that those children knew who Paul was, that they knew who Luke was. This is our chance to meet them. Little Johnny, little Susie, I want you to remember you got to meet the Apostle Paul when you were a little child. They may have been old men and women someday telling their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, I remember the time my mother made sure we got out there. And we met Paul. And we met Luke. That was important for my mama to make sure we did that. Mamas, those who are going to be mamas and those who have been, and grandmothers, children, bring them to church. Make sure they know. That's important. Have a gospel meeting. I want my child to remember that they went to hear Jim Dearman in a gospel meeting there at Rockliff. That's who we're going to have this year. I want them to remember that. It's important to bring children along. I've got memories of old preachers that I read about now in history that my mom and daddy thought it was important enough for me to meet them, and I am so glad that I did. I remember Brother Dixon sitting in our living room talking to my daddy about things going on in the church. I was just a little bitty fella. And that was important for them that I knew that. And I can name some others as well. And the thing is, see, they didn't say, okay, children, all you all go to children's church and play while we'll go out and meet Luke and Paul. They didn't do it that way. No. They brought their children right with them. And that is significant. And significant enough to Paul. Luke, he wanted to make sure we knew that. I thought, these mothers that bring these little children to worship, and the children, a lot of time, you know, at the end of worship, you know, the mother hadn't heard a word of the sermon. She couldn't tell you. All during the prayer, she's sitting there trying her best to keep that child from causing a disturbance, and maybe took them out, you know, sometime during the Lord's Supper or something, and go home exhausted and think, was that worth it? Well, it is. It's worth it. And they are my heroes, because that little child will never know a time they didn't go to church because of those good, godly mothers bringing their children. And I tell you, you can tell. Sometimes I brag on the children when they're leaving. They've done so good. I can say, now you know how to go to church, don't you? So there's a lot of little children, they don't know how to go to church, but you know how to go to church. And just so those children will know they're important. And their parents are teaching them. And I've known mothers that say, well, when they get older and they can behave, I'll take them. And they don't. They don't. Because how are they going to learn to behave if you don't take them? So it's good just from the beginning. Bring those little children. All right. Now, they knelt down on the shore and prayed. They were praying people, weren't they? And we'd taken our leave of one another. We took ship. See how that sounds? That just sounds like an adventure I'd like to go on. We took ship, and they returned home again. And we had finished our course from Tyre. There's those terms again. Finished our course from Tyre. We came to Ptolemais and saluted the brethren and abode with them one day. And the next day we that were of Paul's company departed and came unto Caesarea, and we entered into the house of Philip the evangelist, which was one of the 7, and abode with him. You remember Philip? When they were having the problem serving the Grecian widows, they picked 7 men to see after that. And one of them was Philip. Philip the evangelist. The man that carried the gospel into Samaria. The man that taught and baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. He's still working for the Lord all these many years later. He's here in Caesarea. And so he invites them and said, will you come on home with me? And Philip had some daughters. Now here they are. Tyre, Ptolemais, Caesarea. Watch the arrow go down. And the same man had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. He had 4 young ladies, 4 daughters. They weren't married, and they prophesied. And every now and then someone turns to this and they say, see there, women preachers. That's what they'll say. Women preachers. Now Paul writes to Timothy about how women are to conduct themselves with modesty and shamefacedness and sobriety. It says, now the males pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, and likewise the women also, but in modesty. And I suffer not a woman to teach or usurp authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now that doesn't mean they didn't say anything, but there's a quietness about them. And I know Philip's daughters were not violating that. So how did they prophesy? Well, they could have prophesied in a group where it was permissible for them to be part of the conversation and talk while someone's leading the class. They could have prophesied to their neighbor in a conversation. Come over to the house, sit there around the table like Aquila and Priscilla did with Apollos. They could have prophesied to the ladies. So simply the fact that it says they prophesied does not mean they had women standing up preaching like the men were doing. And so don't get fooled by those that'll use it that way. Now in verse 10. We tarried there many days, and there came down from Judea a certain prophet named Agabus. And when he was come to us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his hands and feet and said, thus saith the Holy Ghost, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man that owneth this girdle, and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. Now that girdle, I want you to think of a long, almost like a long scarf that Paul would tie around to hold his garments together. And Agabus comes in and he undoes that and takes it and binds his hands and his feet. He said, now this is how it's going to be. The man that owns this goes to Jerusalem. Quite a dramatic display there to show him. And here's what happens with this. When he heard these things, both we and they of the place besought him not to go up to Jerusalem. Paul, just don't go. Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. You don't need to go there. Now watch what Paul says. Paul answered, what mean ye to weep and to break mine heart? For I'm ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. Paul, tough little preacher, wasn't he? Florida. Reminds me of some of our missionaries today. I bet Jim Waldron would have been like that. You know, if you ever knew Jim Waldron over in India and Pakistan, I'm ready to go and die if I need to. So don't weep and break my heart over this. And when they would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, the will of the Lord be done. And that's the way you have to answer to things. Things come out of your control. You just have to say, well, God's will be done. Leave it up to the Lord. And so Paul is headed to Jerusalem, knowing that there's going to be trouble to befall him. And after those days, we took up our carriages. That's the luggage. That would included the luggage with all that money he'd collected. Took up our carriages and went up to Jerusalem. See, Jerusalem's up in the hills. So they go up to Jerusalem. And there went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Nason of Cyprus, an old disciple with whom we should lodge. Old Nason. Well, it's the first time we read about him. He was from Cyprus, but he had a house in Jerusalem. And though he was an old man, he could still be of service, couldn't he? They can stay. I'm going to take care of them in my house. What a man of hospitality. So he brought some in, and when we come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. Here they go. Now they're at Jerusalem. Paul had intended to go from Jerusalem back up to Antioch. He never makes that journey. And this then is where we say he ends his third missionary journey, when he arrives at Jerusalem. The day following, Paul went in with us and to James, and all the elders were present. You remember James? James spoke up in Acts chapter 15 about whether the Gentiles, whether they had to obey the law or not. James, the Lord's brother, that wrote the book of James. And tradition tells us he was one of the elders in Jerusalem. And sounds like he is here too. James and all the elders. We might even know, so I don't know if the word's there, but it'd be like saying James and all the other elders that were there. And when they had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they're all zealous of the law. I don't know why this didn't take, but back the one copy of this I have at home, 19 and 20 are in yellow, because that is your memory verse. Okay? Acts 21, 19, and 20. And when they had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the God and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they're zealous of the law. How many Christians were there around Jerusalem? Thousands. These are Jews which believed, but they were also keeping the law. How do you explain that? When Paul would go and preach the gospel, baptize people into Christ, he didn't expect them to change their customs. Now they needed to do what they needed to do as Christians. Paul wouldn't let the Jews bind the Jews' customs on the Gentiles, or the Gentiles bound Gentile customs on the Jews. If the Jews didn't want to eat pork after they were Christians, that's fine. That's fine. It was customary not to eat that. But now they're keeping it as customs and not as a religious ordinance. And we might understand that better than some of they did. Some of them may have had strict religious conviction about some of these customs they were taking. It was a time of transition out of that into the freedom in Christ. And so we're reading a time of transition here. And now there's thousands of Jews still keeping this law as custom. Now watch what happens. They are all informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews that are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying they ought not to circumcise their children, neither walk after the customs. Now that's what they're telling on Paul. But Paul never did say you ought not circumcise your children. All Paul would say is you can't bind your circumcision on the Gentiles. That's what he said. He wasn't telling the Jews, now you don't circumcise your children. He wasn't telling the Jews that. In fact, he had circumcised Timothy himself, hadn't he? So this was a matter of liberty and freedom. And what Paul was teaching But they had misconstrued that, and maybe because some of Paul's enemies telling them false things. Listen, they think you're out there telling them they've got to forsake their customs. So here's what the elders asked Paul to do. What is it therefore? The multitudes must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say of thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Okay, here's a custom. Take them and purify yourself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they are informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. Now the elders of the church asked the Apostle Paul, I want you to go with those 4 men when they go fulfill their vow and shave their heads. Be part of that with them to show this. Watch what Paul does. As touching the Gentiles which believe, now here's what they explain, and we're not binding this on Gentiles. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we've written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. So they weren't binding their customs on Gentiles now, but we've got Jews that are binding this on themselves, and they've heard things about you. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple. Now I want you to notice something. Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ, and had all the authority of an apostle. And when Paul came to Jerusalem, he placed himself under the authority of the elders of the church in Jerusalem. If the Apostle Paul will submit to the judgment of the elders, and that's what we need to do. We don't have elders right now, but we will. And let's realize that once we have elders, elders are going to use the best judgment they can. It's not infallible, but they'll use judgment. And what we need to do, we need to submit to the judgment of the elders. And remember, Paul did. So, Paul took the men the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And that would probably have still bothered me. They're offering an offering as a part of this vow. Now that was a custom, and evidently the custom extended that far, at least in this case with these vows, to even offer an offering there. Now Christ had done away with the fact that you needed to sacrifice and offerings like that. But associated with this vow and this custom, that was part of it. And Paul even went along with that part of it. Okay? Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, they almost pulled this off. The Jews which were of Asia, now these weren't Jerusalem Jews, these were Ephesian Jews, Asian Jews. The Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, cried out, Men of Israel, help! This man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Further, he brought Greeks also into the temple, and they polluted the holy place. Now you don't do that. You don't bring Greeks into the temple, and there was a death penalty for that. But Paul hadn't done that. They falsely accused him. And they may have thought he'd done it. It said they'd seen him before in the city with Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought to the temple. Doesn't say he did it. Trophimus, he's an Asian. He's from Ephesus, a Gentile. And these Jews from Asia recognized him, and they just figured Paul must have brought him into the temple. He didn't do it. He didn't do it. With a false accusation. All the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple forthwith, and the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came to the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Now this chief captain, he's responsible to keep the peace. Well, when that happens, he's going to run out there like the first responders. You know, I'm going to put a stop to this. So immediately he took his soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the chief captain of the soldiers, they left off beating Paul. Kind of reminds me of a few things that used to happen at recess at school. I mean, we get in a good scuffle fight till we say the teacher's coming, and then we just all quit, you know. And so here they come, and they quit beating Paul, and the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. They thought Paul was the troublemaker. Some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty of the tumult, he commanded him to be carried to the castle. The castle. The Jerusalem temple complex was out here. And just outside, right on the wall, was this tall building they here called the castle. That's where the Romans stayed, as a lookout. They could see out over all the temple grounds. That's where they'd keep watch to keep the peace. And they were the ones charged with doing that. And so they're bringing Paul in there, keeping him as a prisoner. We're going to put him in our castle, see. So, when he came up the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him! Away with him!" And Paul was about to be led into the castle. He said to the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Can thou speak Greek?" Paul spoke to him in Greek. And the chief captain wasn't expecting that. See, he misidentified. He thought he knew who this troublemaker was. He said, "Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar and led us out to the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" He thought Paul was an Egyptian. Paul said, "I'm a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak to the people." And when he'd given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with his hands. And all this mob had followed them right up to the foot of those stairs and spread out there. Look what they did. There was a great silence. And he spake to them in the Hebrew tongue. He knew his Greek, and he knew his Hebrew. And these people know Hebrew. So he spake to them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, okay, to be continued. Don't you just hate it when a movie ends that way, or when the TV show ends, and to be continued. But that's where we're going to stop. This is one of the few chapters that ends with a comma. So I highlighted that comma. We'll see what Paul said when we come together next Sunday night and see the next chapter. Paul's dedication is fascinating and tremendous, isn't it? Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. They'll bind you. I'm ready to be bound and die if necessary. Will the will of the Lord be done? And that's the kind of dedication we need to have for the Lord. We become a Christian, it's going to be trouble. I'll face the trouble. Even if it kills me, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do what the Lord wants me to do. And what a great example then Paul was in that matter as well. If you're not a member of the church, you need to be baptized into Christ. Make that. It'll just put priorities into your life and clear things up, and you'll know what you ought to do. And you'll know you'll have that reward in the end. So if you need to respond to the gospel tonight, do it while we stand and sing.